She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand, hold up on she frack, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. For cockacrow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Cockacrow, dagaba, donkey bray, horse and neigh, even duck a quack. Cockacrow, dagaba, donkey bray, horse and neigh, even duck a quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country.
To tell the people the true story about life in the country. Again, we're here to talk about stories about life in the country, wherever you are, whether you're on the quarantine, you're on the West Coast, Barbies, you're in Linden, you're in Ituni, you're in Lethem, Bartica, Port Kaituma. It doesn't matter where you are in Georgetown and outside of Guyana, Barbados. Lots of folks from Barbados are watching, and Canada, the UK, wherever, the United States, wherever you are. Well, right now, we are ready for you on Anansi Web Education. President Granger, good night and welcome again to this program. How are you, sir?
Thank you. It's always good to be on the program and to be in touch with your thousands and thousands of viewers and listeners, to put forward some important views on Anansi Web Education to help make the country better, not only for ourselves and this generation, but for future generations too. I always feel happy to be on this program. Thank you.
And always happy to have you on the show as well. Good night to all of you who are now tuning in. Please share the link and have the folks know that we are on. An interesting topic again, another interesting topic tonight. How's your garden, your kitchen garden going as we prepare for this show?
Well, we've come out of a very long wet season. Now we're in a very hot dry season. So it seems like something Martin Carter would have written about years ago, parching, drought, and flood. So right now we're being parched. And I hope that we get an ease in December, because right now all my pawpaw trees died out. And for the first time for the year, I'm having to buy pawpaws. Otherwise, things are going well. I'm getting quite a few leafy vegetables and okras. How's yours?
Great. Well, it's coming down now to a different season, so the tomatoes and everything, and the watermelons. We've had a successful farm life for the past 2 to 3 months. So yes, success stories indeed. I'll send you some tomatoes because I know that those vegetables in Guyana price gone up, way up. All right, today's topic, President Granger, we're dealing with international trafficking in cocaine has increased since the People's Progressive Party returned to office 50 months ago in August 2020. In fact, sorry, folks, for that little error. They've returned over 50 months ago in August 2020.
2020, you're quite right.
August 2nd, 2020. So again, we're dealing with international trafficking in cocaine has increased since the People's Progressive Party returned to office 50 months ago in August 2020. And so Anansi Web Education, our program, examines the topic of the Shahed syndrome. Shahed syndrome, with the aim of addressing the following questions. And we go to the first question, President Granger. What have been the effects of the Shahed syndrome on the country? And Shahed syndrome, what has been that effect?
Well, when we speak of a syndrome, I'm not a medical person. You're speaking about something more than a disease. You're speaking about a condition which can have a variety of causes and consequences. It's something that just goes on from different sources and it is not something that's easy to stamp out. So when you speak of a syndrome in Guyana, when you speak about the effect of this syndrome on the country, we're looking at corruption. Uh, Narco trafficking corrupts the officials, the government and law enforcement and judicial officers and so on, who have to handle it. So that is one factor. It also deals with criminality because narco trafficking brings guns into the country, and people use guns to extend the drug trade, extend their territory, the drug empire, and also to deal with the rivals because it's a very lucrative business. And once you get drugs and guns, you're going to have murders, extrajudicial killings. This is what we saw in the early years of this century. So they all go together: the drugs, the guns, and murders. But in addition to that, you have corrupt officers. So sometimes you find yourself going before a law enforcement officer who himself has been bought out. I'm not accusing anyone, but this is the danger of the syndrome. But there's also an economic side. If people are involved in drug trafficking, you end up in money laundering. So I think you see how it is starting to spread. So if you were running an enterprise honestly, and the next man is a drug trafficker, he keeps on selling you because he can afford to. He's rich, and he's trying to launder money, and you have to sell a commodity for $100. He's selling it for $50 or $80. So it creates a distorted economy that people are not seeing the true cost of an item because it is being subsidized by dirty money. So you got money laundering as well. And this makes a mess of the economy because who wants to produce something valued at $100 when it is going to be undersold by a drug trafficker selling the same commodity for $80? So people stop producing. And I think in economics, people have they have an effect in which dirty money would tend to attract more business because it means that more people are going to stop producing and start going into drug trade, which of course doesn't produce food, simply because that drug trade is more profitable for them. So the whole thing, if a farmer is growing sweet potatoes, for example, which could be sold maybe for $400 a kilo, he would just switch to growing ganja, which is being sold for $1,000 a kilo. So the whole, you can't give your baby, ganja, for breakfast in the morning instead of porridge. So and this syndrome affects every part of society and the economy. Public officials become corrupted. There's money laundering. There's economic distortion, and there's social degradation because eventually the drugs are going to get to young people or young boys and girls, and people are going to end up doing strange things in order to get some drugs. And I think most Guyanese would have come in contact with a family or a situation in which perfectly, I suppose, decent families, if you want to use that expression, have some child or some son or daughter who has a drug habit and start to steal things in the house to feed that habit. I know personally, I can tell you about some personal experiences in which families have been broken up because their child got caught in the cocaine habit. So it is a total disease, it's a total syndrome which can affect every part of society. That is what I would say is the effect. It just destroys society. It just destroys families. It just destroys the economy, and it corrupts the law enforcement agencies. It's terrible.
Thank you. It indeed corrupts the law enforcement agency. It corrupts politicians, officials of regime. So if you're now joining us, tonight's discussion is international trafficking in cocaine has increased since the People's Progressive Party, yes, the PPP, International trafficking in cocaine has increased since the PPP has returned to office 50 months ago in August of 2020. And so this takes us to the second question, President Granger. When did the Shahed syndrome become a significant public security matter in Guyana?
It is difficult to put your finger on a particular date or year. I recall as when I was National Security Advisor in the PNC administration under President Hoyt, I was also already a member of the National Drug Law Enforcement Committee. That was in 1990. So it was the early stages of trafficking were evident as early as 1990, but the big haul started under the PPP in 1997 when we had a ship in Guyana's harbor, the MV Danielson. But I would say that from about 2000, after I would say that Mrs. Jagan, was intent in stamping out the trade in the early stages. But by around 2000, I think when she departed, she left office in 1999. And by 2000, narco trafficking was rampant. I would say that from there, it led into what we call the troubles, in which people definitely bringing in huge amounts of drugs. People were becoming fantastically rich. Property values were soaring. Drug traffickers were building huge housing schemes. And they were trying to extend the drug empires into villages, particularly in East Bank, Demerara, and East Coast, Demerara. And those villages were hit hard. And I would say that the troubles was all about drug trafficking. The murders, the extrajudicial killings, the drug gangs, the swaggering, the telephone tampering. All of these things are products of the Shahed syndrome from about 2000. And that was the cause of the deaths of so many hundreds of people, because people were trying to become fantastically rich. And the greed that was propelling the drug trade just continued to push them so that they could get more territory, more drugs, more money. So it's a cycle of corruption. And the more people got involved, the more they corrupt public officials. So when police officers were getting a small amount of money, those days they might have just been getting $50,000 or $60,000. Somebody just give them $250,000 or more. So you can see the effects that fuel the violence during the Troubles. And when people got in the way, you would get murders. And for the first time in the history of this country, you had a situation in which, the Minister of Home Affairs himself, responsible for enforcing the National Drug Strategy plans, for enforcing counter-narcotics measures, he himself had to be investigated for running a death squad under the PPP. And then, people were being killed because they knew too much or they spoke too much. We all remember cases of the, Bacchus murder and the Kizarski and so on. Those are very bad days. And I think there was a mood of anxiety and uncertainty. People just started leaving the country in greater numbers than they were leaving before. So the effects of the Shahed syndrome, were most noticeable during the Troubles, right? Literally from about 2000 for the next 15 years or so. And you can go back to the United States International Narcotics Control Strategy reports, and you can see the criticism of the absence of any drug policy in Guyana during those years. And it's there for everybody to read, the murders, the volumes of drug trafficking. And at one stage, the administration of the day was actually dodging the establishment of a DEA office in Georgetown. they were giving the DEA a lot of unsafe and old houses, and they were playing a game, it's quite clearly. And they were demanding more money. And the US ambassador said plainly, we are not going to give you money to suppress the drugs when we know drug lords are walking on Georgetown without being arrested. So there was almost a confrontation between the administration and the United States at that time. At the same time, the whole security structure started to collapse gradually because of the rot, and you had situation in which this country was trying to bring in Bernard Kerik and other people. The violence became so extreme that attempts were made to get help from Britain. I don't know if calling in Bernard Kerik was a matter of getting help, but certainly it was extreme, and people were turning to extreme measures. So I would say that the period of the Troubles was definitely a very great period in our history, and it wasn't a social revolt. As far as I'm concerned, it was a drug gang warfare. I mean, and this is the expression that was used by the head of the presidential secretariat. And I believe in this regard, although I would disagree with him on many matters, it was a period of drug gang warfare. And if you talk about drug gang, you're talking about narco trafficking.
Drug gang warfare. And again, today's topic, we're talking about international trafficking in cocaine and the fact that it has increased again since the People's Progressive Party, PPP, returned to office 50 months ago in August of 2020. Drug trafficking is rampant. The planes are coming in, the submarines are coming, all manner of things, the planes, tons upon tons of cocaine. And the third question, President Granger, where has the Shahed syndrome had its gravest and greatest impact?
In geographical terms, I would say that the villages of East Demerara were the hardest hit. Traditionally, from the immediate post-emancipation period, there were very large concentrations of people in East Demerara and East Bank. You don't have to go into reasons for that, but they became targets of the drug trade because they felt that these people could be both couriers or people who were doing the drug running at a low level and consumers. And so I don't know the thinking of the drug lords at the time that you had communities where they could produce both consumers and couriers at the same time. So the consumption of drugs started to destroy lives, started to destroy families, and the drug traffickers at that time felt that they could make a profit. So some of the drugs, I presume the bulk of the drugs would have been exported to more lucrative markets in North America and Western Europe. But at the same time, people were becoming addicted to drugs, and I think you could go to some areas and see drug addicts. People were just stealing and doing all sorts of things to get money to buy drugs. So in the final analysis, it was very profitable for the drug lords. And then we saw people in the law enforcement agencies being corrupted. At one stage, we had to, I think the head of the Customs and Narcotics Unit was assassinated. And you had policemen being involved. And I said, it was bringing about a collapse of normal government in this country. A few people were getting extremely rich, but a lot of people were becoming, extremely poor and suffering because of drug trafficking. So the greatest impact geographically was on the coast, but at the same time, because planes were landing in the hinterland, many of the villages also became contaminated because they knew that these landings were taking place, and there was no intelligence system to report information to the center. In fact, at that time, I don't know if the center was interested in finding out who was landing, who was bringing in, but people knew that the planes were landing. So I cannot say that it corrupted the hinterland communities, but in the same way that the coastal communities were corrupted. But I would say that the greatest impact was in the villages in Demerara. Later on, I think it was quite evident that many other villages, I don't know if the administration at the time felt that this was a sort of fault of the users, that, it's like self-harm. They felt that if you wanted to take drugs, well, you have nobody but yourself to blame. But when it started to go into other communities and you started to see murders and a lot of deviant behavior, then I think they realized it was becoming a national problem. But I think for most of the troubles, the target areas were East Coast and East Bank, and that's where we found most of the murders.
Thank you so much, there, President. Responding to that question about which was the third question, where has the Shahed syndrome had its gravest and greatest impact? And you did mention the deputy head of KANU, Customs and
Anti-narcotics unit.
Anti-narcotics, yeah, thank you, was assassinated, was murdered back in the early 2000s. Vibert Innes, and to this day, the family has not gotten any sort of justice. But the targeting of Deputy Head of Customs, Vibert Innes, wasn't accidental or coincidental. It was a targeted assassination, as we speak here now, of the Shahed syndrome. We go to the fourth question. Why has the Shahed syndrome been allowed to prevail up to the present?
Well, of course, you realize Shahed is not a person. It is just a description of a syndrome. It's almost like a medical term, because, this started long before anybody, was regarded as a sort of drug lord, and it continued up to the present. So this is just to emphasize the fact that Shahed is a condition. It's not a citizen of Guyana. It continues because it is lucrative, it is profitable, and there are people in high levels of this country who are not interested in stamping it out. And it is clear that if people are landing in the hinterland, you deploy your troops and your policemen to the likely places where they could land. You'd use drones, you'd use some type of surveillance equipment. But when you decide not to do it, you're allowing it to continue. When you decide not to take countermeasures, not implement countermeasures, it means that you are allowing narco trafficking to continue. So that is one of the main reasons. There's lack of political will, that within the ministries, within the government, there is no apparatus, there's no will to bring the narco trade to an end. There's some countries without, narco trade. For example, people like to praise Singapore. Singapore is such an orderly country. But, people are executed for having a few, grams of ganja. And here we have people who are known to be involved in cocaine trafficking. And what happens is you transfer policemen from one place to the other. You conduct sometimes you don't conduct investigations. It's just a whispering campaign, and it just goes on. It's been going on for over 30 years. And there is no time, except during my presidency between 2015 and 2020, in which you can say people, just remove themselves from prominent positions. Prior to 2015, known drug lords would be swaggering Um, I remember in one case, a notorious drug lord had to be caught in another jurisdiction during the PPP administration, although he was known to be moving around and they knew the nightclub, they knew his girlfriends, but he was never arrested. And it was only when he went into another country that he was arrested. I think the president of that country actually called his police chief the sheriff. That is Suriname. I think President Bogsi actually called Mr. Santoki the sheriff. And Santoki used to wear a sheriff hat, because, he was regarded as being committed to stamping out drug trafficking in Suriname. So when drug traffickers fled from Guyana to Suriname, that is where they run into the sheriff and they got extradited. But Guyana had no interest in actually arresting and extraditing drug traffickers. And they just allowed it to prevail because too many people profited. You talk about money laundering, you talk about gun running, you're talking about, you know, um, you know, corrupting police officers. You're talking about being able to run business startups because some people would take a few grams and they travel overseas and they come and start up a little business. So it became a part of the dark economy, and few people were interested in stamping it out. And this is the situation we have in this country now. There is now no serious policy to prevent cocaine coming into this country or leaving this country. And there's no serious enforcement policy. And that is why it prevails, because there's no political will, there's no organizational structure, there's no legal mechanism by which these people could be prosecuted, and it just goes on. And nobody knows when it will stop if we have the PPP in charge of law enforcement. There's no telling when it will be brought to an end. The Americans are more concerned about it, the DEA. And when you see a big bust take place, it's because DEA is behind it. It's not local intelligence, I can tell you that for sure. The DEA is providing the information. The DEA is calling the shots. And people do not know until the last moment, if at all, that there's going to be a bust. And the DEA is behind every major drug bust in the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, not Kano.
And thank you so much for that the DEA is behind every major drug bust in Guyana. It is said that sometimes these so-called agencies responsible for drugs are most times not informed, or last minute they are told such and such without any details. And that explains what is really happening in those agencies in Guyana. Takes us to our second to last question. Who are the victims who suffer from the effects of the Shahed syndrome? And you did mention earlier Kanu officer Vibert Innes. Many of you who may remember Vibert Innes, deputy head of Kanu at that time when he was gunned down. There was no interest at that time for any investigations under the PPP regime. It's as though they didn't care, they weren't concerned, there's no justice. And almost 20 years, there is still no justice at all. The family have not gotten any sort of justice, the family members. So now takes us to our second to last question. Again, who are the victims who suffer from the effects of the Shahed syndrome?
This is not such an easy question to answer. Certainly, particularly young people who consume the illegal narcotics suffer because many of them can't recover. There is no proper rehabilitation system in Guyana. A few people go, I think the Salvation Army has a center, and rehabilitation is not taken as a serious course of action in this country. So young people, I know, sometimes from personal experience, I know have become addicts, and they have become problems for their families, particularly their mothers. They sell their mothers jewelry, and I know people sometimes have to abandon the addict, and sometimes the treatment is not successful, and it becomes a great burden on the family because many poor families cannot afford to keep their children, in treatment. So the users are obviously the first victims, but there are other people who get sucked into the trade, and it leads to trafficking in persons, and unfortunately, the other young girls are sucked into that, and it leads to corruption. Again, you can have enforcement officers who are susceptible to bribes and to and to do to get involved in wrongdoing, and you see this happening sometimes at the ports. I think in times past we had some equipment which, from the time it arrived, it would just stay there for 1 year, 2 years, and they somehow, could never get it to work. And as soon as you try to fix it, it will go bad again. Similarly, the international airports, you can always find somebody at the low level who would maybe put drugs on board the plane or take drugs off. So you see, it tends to operate at different levels. At the lowest level, you have people who are really handlers or couriers. And sometimes you hear stories about people being just give them a package to deliver in some Caribbean country, and they don't know what they're carrying. They may be innocent. Again, it is not a crime that is carefully documented. And I would say the victims suffer. The victims tend to be young persons who are experimenting with drugs, maybe to get a high or to use drugs for recreational purposes. But there are some who are basically traffickers, and they make their living by getting young people hooked on drugs. So the victims could be widespread. Officials could be affected. Victims of trafficking could be affected. Young people looking for fun could be affected. But as a whole, the country suffers because the economy could be, disrupted because of money laundering, and of course, people would move their production out of what you may call useful crops, food crops, and into drugs. And this is what would be happening. It's not cocaine is one thing. We don't produce cocaine here, but I've seen some extensive farmlands, being given over to ganja production. And if you imagine that those farmlands could have been producing food, we'd have no food problem in Guyana. But people are into drugs because it's profitable. And I would say that the victims suffer because, the whole country ends up, paying, four or $500 a kilo for something as simple as sweet potatoes, because the lands which should be growing food are producing ganja. So the whole narcotics trade turns the economy upside down, and we all suffer. But particularly, the consumers tend to be members of poor families who can ill afford, to maintain the habit, and they end up on the street. And sometimes when you look on the street, you see a lot of young persons who are really drug addicts. They're not there because they're poor or unemployed. They're there because they are addicted to drugs. And those are persons who should be, in other forms of employment, building families, building professions, and helping to develop the country. But we're losing a huge part of the generation of young people because of this crime.
Thank you so much, President Granger, and all of you watching. If you're now joining us, good night and welcome to Anansi Web Education. Tonight's topic, very interesting, international trafficking in cocaine. It has increased since the People's Progressive Party, the PPP, returned to office 50 months ago, in August 2nd, in fact, in August 2nd of 2020. Our final question for tonight, President Granger. How has the Shahed syndrome influenced international perceptions of this country, Guyana?
I would say that the general perception of Guyana as a law-abiding country has suffered because they now see Guyana as not only a transit point, and this has been emphasized over and over again by the United States State Department International Narcotics Control Strategy Report. It's not just a transit point, but it is in danger of becoming a narco state in which the economy, regardless of petroleum production, the heart of the economy, day-to-day trade, everyday business, is controlled by drug traffickers. And one way of getting into the legal or legitimate economy is through dirty money. So people could get involved in, providing services for the petroleum economy by providing capital that is generated from the drug trade. So we see a lot of stuff going up there, not accusing anyone, of course. You see a lot of buildings, you see a lot of changes taking place within the so-called private enterprise. But, the question is, where does the money come from? And it's not just a matter of getting money, just as if you went to the bank. This money is going to bring debt, it's going to bring guns, and the people who provided the drugs from overseas are going to want to be paid. So it creates a cycle of crime that if people from a drug-producing country send drugs into this country, they want to be paid. They don't want to lose their business. They don't want their commodities to be seized, and they don't want people coming to the doorstep apologizing for losing the commodity. Some people are going to get killed. And I would say that the international perception is going to harm Guyana in the long term. People are speaking a lot about having conferences and bringing business to Guyana, but a lot of people are very nervous. A lot of people are afraid of the corruption. A lot of people are afraid of the description of Guyana as a narco platform. And perhaps you could get much more business done if we were straight, if we were honest. So even though some people are satisfied that are happy that the oily petroleum economy is bringing business, the narco economy is keeping business out. In the long term, we will lose because there are a lot of clean investors who will not come in. And many countries now in the West, prohibit their companies from doing business with businesses in Guyana which are associated with the drug trade. And we've seen that, and of course the Americans play with the cards very close to the chest, and we've seen people who have had their visas suspended or taken away. We've seen businesses which cannot get loans from certain Western banks and cannot transact business with certain legitimate Western banks because they're involved in laundering dirty money, very frequently from narcotics trade. So in the long term, if not in the middle term, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. And international perceptions count. And if people feel that coming to Guyana is going to be risky because of corruption and cocaine trafficking, narco trafficking, they'll go somewhere else. They go to St. Lucia or Barbados, which appears, is more is a rule-governed jurisdiction. But we are hurting ourselves. Although a few people might be getting rich, we're hurting ourselves as a nation by not doing more to suppress the narcotics trade. We are perceived increasingly as becoming a narco state.
Again. But quickly before we go, we know, and this is not part of questions that I have for you, but I do know the evidence is there that under your presidency, you ensured that the right set of folks were in positions, whether it's law enforcement positions, to take care, to tackle these problems. Uh, how satisfied were you that the correct persons were put in place?
I don't have the files, I cannot judge. But what I do know is that when I was in office, we had set up a separate organization, the National Anti-Narcotics Unit, because the KANU simply did not have the capacity. And once you set up NANA, it means putting certain procedures in place. For example, people had to do the polygraphing. People had to be carefully selected, properly paid, and they had to be polygraphed at certain intervals. Um, and to some extent, to quote an American politician, you go to war with the troops you have, not the troops you want. So we had to use the personnel that we had, but in every instance, we tried to make sure that the rules the laws were properly applied, and that as far as possible, that at the ministerial level, we made sure that there was no political interference in professional decisions, and you allow the professionals to do their work. But there are limits to that, and it is impossible within the period of time we had in government, which was actually cut short by the no confidence motion in 2018. We got into 2015, by 2018, the no confidence motion. It actually reduced our ability to run the country properly because, in the manner of speaking, the Western powers turned off the taps. So even though the economy had started to generate revenues from petroleum, we could not access those funds. So we were broke. The government was broke, and we could not implement some of the plans that we had because the money is kept in Western banks. It's not kept in Bank of Guyana. So we could not bring about certain changes, and then again you had a widespread problem. You can't just purge the entire judiciary, magistracy, the police force. And, I would say that we had very good police officers, we have very good judges, we have very good law enforcement officers. But some of the persons in different levels of those organizations were corrupt. There's no denying that. And I think they didn't do their job. We put some managerial and administrative changes. For example, there were more magistrates courts in this country now than before. There are police divisions. At one time, that huge interior used to be one division, and we created a structure in which each regional chairman had a regional police commander at his side, so that that he could rely on collaborating with the police commander, so that the intelligence and information and so on will be probably transmitted. So I would say that we had to make structural changes. And if there was any lag, it would be in terms of providing the quality of training to the officials that is necessary to ensure a more law-abiding jurisdiction. But there's just not enough time in 3 years to undo 30 years of damage.
You guys did a great job. Lots of people know the evidence is there. Unfortunately, hey, guess what? Back to international trafficking in cocaine. It's out there that it has increased. The evidence is out there. It has increased again since the People's Progressive Party, the PPP, returned to office 50 months ago. Drug trafficking rampant. Planes and so forth. We know about the submarine. The planes are just mysteriously appearing. Mysteriously, the men just run away all the time. The same story. The men ran away, and that's the end of the story. President Granger, though, yeah, I know it's gone. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for what you have done during your presidency. We saw a different Guyana, a cleaner Guyana. People were able to breathe again. Drug lords went underground for the most part. We didn't see these mysterious planes popping in. We didn't see a lot of things. People began to have a sense of hope and patriotism under your presidency. Again, thank you so much for what you have done to the country. More could have been done, but like you've said, 3 years cut short, 3 years. The pipeline was cut off, all manner of things. But thank you. People want to see those bright days again. Thank you so much, sir, for your time tonight.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. And to all of our listeners, see you again next week. Same place, same time on 107.1 FM with Anansi Web Education. Good night.
All day I back down, me now I come home. Inaga, jackass, yeah, I forget you, Lord. Cockle shy hand, bag over shoulder, running by his side, a Rexy and Rover. From the farm, them a come. So now go down, but up the river. Some washing clothes, some folks are bathing at the water. Fisherman, they catch them